My name is Noriko Shikata, Deputy Cabinet Secretary of Prime Minister's Office. At the outset, I'd like to introduce a few points from Mr. Edano's press conference this morning. He commented on the issue of the release of radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. This release of radioactive water into the sea, some pointed out that detailed explanation should have given in advance to neighboring countries and other related parties. We will sincerely take that point and conduct a thorough communication in the future. Meaning we will try to make sure that what we are doing would be understood by other countries, including our neighboring countries. The second point is this discharging water with a lower level of radiation materials from the nuclear power plant into the sea was, from our viewpoint, unavoidable measure in order to prevent the release of water with highly radioactive concentration estimated more than 200,000 times compared to the radiation level of the water discharged. We will redouble our efforts to provide more detailed explanation of the situation to the relevant the people concerned. And regarding possible damage on the fishing activities or fishing industry, compensation, including temporary payments, will be made for the loss of fishing industry incurred by the release of the radioactive water into the sea. And lastly, Mr. Eda mentioned that he believes that the consultations with the Food Safety Commission on the provisional standard values for marine resources will be necessary. So this is something that that will be examined in terms of ensuring food safety of marine life. Now I'd like to ask my colleague from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Takeshi Matsunaga, to go next.
Thank you, Mr. Shikata. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start my explanation with respect to the cooperation of other countries and international organizations. Before going to respective assistance and cooperation or meetings, I'd like to refer to the announcement or information recently released by an international organization, that is an announcement from World Health Organization. I previously mentioned about news release and frequently asked questions issued by World Health Organizations. Yesterday, the organizations updated their information with respect to Japan in relation to the health risk concerning the nuclear plant accident. Yesterday, the World Health Organization announced in their website that there are no health risks so far to people living in other countries from radioactive material released into the atmosphere from the Japanese nuclear power plants. It further stated that radiation levels measured to date in other countries are far below the level of background radiation that most people are exposed to in normal everyday circumstances. The World Health Organization also updated their frequently asked questions. They updated 3 items. The first one concerns what is the current risk of radiation-related health problems in Japan for those residing near the reactor in comparison to those in other parts of Japan. And they provided the following answer. Radiation-related health consequences will depend on exposure, which is dependent on several things, including the amount and type of radiation released from the reactor, weather conditions such as wind and rain, a person's proximity to the plant, and the amount of time spent in irradiated areas. The government of Japan's recent actions in response to events at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant are in line with the existing recommendations for radiation exposure. The government has evacuated individuals who are living within a 20-kilometer radius around the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Those living between 20 kilometers and 30 kilometers from the plant are being asked to evacuate voluntarily. In general, people living farther away are at lower risk than those who live nearby. As and if the situation changes, the government of Japan may change their advice to the public. WHO is following the situation closely. And the second frequently asked question they updated asks, is there a risk of radioactive exposure from food contamination? And for the answer, they stated, yes, there is a risk of exposure as a result of contamination in food. But they continued, however, contaminated food would have to be consumed over prolonged periods to represent a risk to human health. The presence of radioactivity in some vegetables and milk has been confirmed, and some of the initial food monitoring results show radioactive iodine detected in concentration above Japanese regulatory limits. Radioactive cesium has also been detected. Local government authorities have advised residents to avoid these foods and have implemented measures to prevent their sales and distribution. For the last question they updated, they asked, are there health risks to people living outside of Japan from radiation emitted into the atmosphere from demanded Japanese nuclear power plants? From damaged Japanese nuclear power plants. In answer, they stated, thus far there are no health risks to people living in other countries from radioactive material released into the atmosphere from the Japanese nuclear power plants. Radiation levels measured to date in other countries are far below the level of background radiation that most people are exposed in everyday circumstances. Radiation levels are being monitored by the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, CTBTO, which operates 63 surveillance stations around the world. The information I provided for given in writing on the table. Next, I would like to mention about several additional cooperation extended by other countries and organizations. Today, relief supplies arrived in Narita from European Union. This time, the relief supplies are supplied by Hungary, Slovakia, and Sweden through European Union. They consist of 16.7 tons of foodstuff, 4,000 pieces of clothes, 1,000 pairs of shoes, 10,000 pairs of gloves, and about 300 pairs of boots. After arriving in Narita, these supplies will be transported to and distributed in various disaster-stricken areas in Miyagi Prefecture. Japan deeply appreciates the cooperation of European Union and its member countries. As of April 5th, announcements through European Union for relief supplies have been made by the following European Union member states: Ireland, UK, Austria, the Netherlands, Greece, Sweden, Slovakia, Denmark, Hungary, Finland, France, Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Luxembourg. The previous relief supplies from European Union, consisting of blankets, mattress, and sleeping bags, arrived on March 24th and delivered to Ibaraki Prefecture. Some of the blankets were also delivered to Tochigi Prefecture. I also would like to mention about donation from Austria. We are informed that in response to the Great East Japan earthquake, the government of Austria had provided monetary donations through the country's Red Cross. From Austria, we have received letters and messages from many dignitaries, including His Excellency Dr. Heinz Fischer, Federal President of the Republic of Austria, His Excellency Mr. Werner Faymann, Federal Chancellor, His Excellency Dr. Michael Spindelegger, Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs. Furthermore, on March 22nd, Foreign Minister Spindelegger visited the Japanese embassy in Austria and signed a book of condolences. The government of Japan deeply appreciates the expression of solidarity and great amount of cooperation of the government and people of Austria. And as you see in the revised matrix concerning relief supply, we have received relief supplies from Turkey, which consists of blankets, seats, canned tuna, canned green peas, canned fish, and water. They arrived 4th of April. And also we received more than 4,600 of canned beef from Uruguay on the date of 4th of April. We greatly appreciate their cooperation. Finally, I'd like to mention about today's telephone conversations between Japanese and New Zealand foreign ministers. Early this afternoon, Foreign Minister Matsumoto had telephone talks with his New Zealand counterpart, the Honorable Mr. Harry Mackley, Minister of Foreign Affairs. In the talks, Mr. Matsumoto appreciated New Zealand government's various considerations for the confirmation of safety of 28 Japanese victims of the earthquake in the South Island of New Zealand, as well as their bereaved families. Mr. Matsumoto also wished the progress as to the investigation of the reasons for the collapse of the CTV building. He also expressed his heartfelt appreciation for New Zealand's dispatch of rescue team of 52 members, the provision of monetary donations, etc. In response, Mr. Mackley expressed his gratitude for Japanese cooperation towards the earthquake of the South Island of New Zealand and extended condolences for the victims of the Great East Japan earthquake, stating that he was prepared to continue necessary cooperation for the families of the Japanese victims of the New Zealand South Island earthquake. Mr. Mackley stated that he would like to strengthen the bilateral and multilateral cooperation in the field of disaster prevention and counter-disaster measures, making use of both countries' experience in those fields. Mr. Matsumoto explained about the Japanese government's response to assist the people who suffered from the disaster including those who had evacuated from their residence, as well as to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, adding that the government would continue providing information promptly and accurately. Furthermore, Mr. Matsumoto expressed his determination to proceed the path of reconstruction in a forceful manner, like New Zealand. The two foreign ministers concurred on the continued close communication between them, with a view to further strengthening the bilateral relations. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'd like to ask Mr. Nishiyama of NISA to go next.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to update the status of Fukushima Daiichi plants. The parameters of reactors of the units 1 through 3 are relatively stable. We are transferring the water in the hot well to the condensate storage tank as preparation to move the stagnant water to the hot well with respect to the units 1 through 3. We are considering to introduce nitrogen to the containment vessel of the unit 1 first, and then possibly units 2 and 3 in the future to prevent hydrogen explosion. This is, we are still considering and adjusting the conditions with TEPCO. Regarding a spent fuel pool of the unit 3, we are throwing the pure water, 75 tons of pure water. Regarding the emergency release of slightly radiated water in the radioactive waste disposal system and in the reactor and the turbine buildings of the Unit 6 to the sea, TEPCO's work has been going smoothly. The former is preparation for TEPCO's move for TEPCO to move the highly radiated stagnant water in the turbine building of the Unit 2 there. There means radioactive waste disposal system. And the latter, which is related to the underground water, including the Unit 6. The action is to protect the Units 5 and 6 from intrusion of the water, which will harm important equipments in the basement of those units, especially those related to cooling systems. We successfully stopped the highly radiated water spilling from the crack of the outside wall of the pit where electricity cables are stored. We injected two kinds of chemical liquids which can fill the room among stones and rocks under the ground. We put those chemicals to both the ground beneath the pit and the bottom of the pit. However, we are alerted that the highly radiated water may appear elsewhere, or the surface of the same kinds of water in the trench of Unit 2 may rise. We are closely monitoring those possibilities. And finally, we sprayed synthetic plastic for the third time to settle the radiated dust which fell to the ground after hydrogen explosions and other events at Units 1, 3, and maybe 4. It seems that the synthetic plastic has been effective to a certain extent to calm down the radiated dust. Thank you very much for listening.
Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Shinichi Kawara, the advisor to MEX, to go next.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Allow me to speak in Japanese. On behalf of MEXT, I would like to give a report that we are conducting the monitoring out of 20-kilometer zone of Fukushima Daiichi MPP. We are monitoring both the land and sea, and also we are conducting the monitoring from the air. And the area that we cover is an area beyond 20 kilometers from the Fukushima Daiichi. I would like to share some new developments. I'm afraid you don't have the English translation, but if you refer to the very last page, there's one page. This is a monitoring by aircraft. In the past, we have been requested that we use low-speed helicopter to conduct monitoring, and we have been able to start such an operation as of today using low-speed helicopter. First is that MEXT is using a private sector helicopter to monitor the area, which is within 60 to 80 kilometers of the Daiichi nuclear power plant. The another is DOE of the United States using small aircraft and helicopters to monitor the range within 60 kilometers radius. And when we have the results, we would add on to our information, and we will share that information with you without delay. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Shinano of the Nuclear Safety Commission to go next.
それでは、
Good evening. I would like to report to you the result of the assessment of the environmental monitoring data. And this is from 1300 hours of April 4th to 10 a.m. on April 5th. So overall, the assessment result is that we did not have data that would have immediate health risk. But unlike what I have reported previously, there are two updates that are made in the report. So I would like to highlight the updated portion of our report. First of all, having to do with spatial radiation dose rate at the bottom of the second paragraph. So we are preparing technical data necessary to study further actions to be taken. That sentence had been added. And as you are aware of, in this radius from 20 to 30 kilometers, the citizens had been instructed to take shelter and stay indoors. But already 3 weeks has passed since this instruction had been issued. So the taking shelter had been prolonged, and in some area, the spatial radiation dose rate accumulation had gone beyond 10 microsievert. So since such data had been gathered, what would be the most appropriate measure to be taken needs to be studied from technical perspective. Secondly, having to do with radioactive concentration in the air, the concentration level had come down from yesterday's level for both iodine and cesium, and the concentration limit, of course, is not exceeded. Turning to aviation monitoring, we have obtained no new information, so there was no new assessment that was carried out. Going on to environmental samples. So as far as the data that has been gathered, compared to yesterday's data, there had been some readings that had increased. And going on to the fourth paragraph, this paragraph had been added newly. So for marine sea products, be aware of the information related with the request announced by the MHLW. As you are already aware of, off the coast of Fukushima, the land fish had been monitored, and this had exceeded the limit, and so this is why this sentence had been added. So going on to the fifth item, environmental radioactivity level by prefecture. There was no new information available for tap water, so we do not have any new assessment result for the tap water. So that is the daily report this evening. Thank you.
My colleague from Fisheries Agency, Mr. Shoichi Takayama, he's the Deputy Director of Resources and Environment Research Division of Fishery Agency, to go next. Thank you.
Allow me to present to you in Japanese. So in the peripheral prefecture of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, monitoring of radiation level had been carried out, and except for one sample, we have disclosed data that all the readings had been below the limit. But on the 4th of April, Ibaraki Fisheries Co-op had obtained readings of the landsfish, which had cesium level of 526 becquerels, which exceeds the provisional limit. So Ibaraki Prefecture has issued a request to restrict shipment of the landsfish, which is caught off the coast of Ibaraki, and the fishery co-ops had followed suit of this instruction. In order to ensure safety of the sea products or seafood, flatfish and also other fishes are subjected to sampling, and in Chiba, off the coast of Choshi, fish such as mackerel and other fish such as sardine are to be sampled. And with full coordination with the other prefectures involved, monitoring and sampling activities shall be carried out.
Now, I'd like to open the floor for questions. And when you ask a question, please identify yourself with your name and affiliation, and please limit your question to only one.
Hi, Kosaku Narioka, Dow Jones Newswire. Mr. Nishiyama, you just said you are planning to or considering to inject nitrogen to the containment vessel at reactor 1, 2, 3 units. And is the likelihood of the hydrogen explosion is increasing or decreasing at each reactor? And how do you measure the likelihood of such an event? And what is like the level of hydrogen at each reactor? And if it's not the likelihood of an hydrogen explosion is not increasing, why are you considering to do it now? And if you could explain how nitrogen can prevent hydrogen explosion.
ダウジョーンズニュースワイヤーの成岡と申します。西山審議官は先ほど1号機から3号機の格納容器に窒素を注入する予定であるとおっしゃいましたけれども、水素 爆発の可能性は高まっているんでしょうか、それとも下がっているんでしょうか。そして水素爆発の可能性というのはどのようにして測定するのでしょうか。そして現在各原子炉における水素のレベルはどのぐらいなのでしょうか。そして水素爆発の可能性が上昇をしていないのであれば、なぜ今この時点でこのことというのは要するに窒素の注入を検討されているんでしょうか。そして窒素の注入がどのようにして水素爆発を防ぐのかご説明いただけますでしょうか。合わせて。
まず今水を入れて1、2、3号機とも冷却をしております。でこの冷却が進むと蒸気の発生が少なくなって、格納容器の中の気圧が下がり、外から酸素を招き入れてしまう可能性があります。
First of all, we are now cooling all of the units 1, 2, and 3 by injecting water. And when the cooling goes on, there will be less generation of vapor. And as a result, the pressure in the containment vessel will decline. And this may bring in this may create the possibility of bringing in H2O from the outside. Excuse me. It may have this may have the possibility of bringing in oxygen. Excuse me, oxygen from the outside.
それで今各号機の中にどのくらい水素があるかというのは分かりませんけれども、放射能によるその水素の発生も考えられますし、それから過去に燃料が損傷した時の水素の発生も考えられるので、それほど多くの水素があるとは思っていませんけれども、今のうちにその酸素との間での一定の比率になると爆発を起こす可能性があるので、そこに窒素をそうならないように入れてしまおうということです。
And we do not know for sure how much hydrogen there is in each of the units. But of course, there is the possibility that hydrogen may have been generated by the radioactivity, and also there's a possibility that hydrogen may have been generated as a result of the damage to the fuel that had taken place in the past. We do not believe there is a lot of hydrogen inside the units, but when we consider that there is a possibility of an explosion occurring when the ratio between hydrogen and oxygen reaches a certain ratio, we thought that we might adjust that ratio before it we thought that we might inject nitrogen in before the level reaches that ratio, which may lead to the likelihood of an explosion.
窒素を入れることによってその酸素が入ってくることを妨げて、仮に水素があったとしてもその爆発には至らないようにしてしまうということです。
And by injecting nitrogen, we can prevent the oxygen from coming in. And as a result, even if there is hydrogen inside, we can create a situation where an explosion will not occur.
Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe Palka from National Public Radio. We've heard data today about the radiation levels around Fukushima plant. I wonder if you can say anything about whether there are any measurable levels of radiation here in Tokyo, And if so, how much? And also, how do these levels, or how do normal levels in Tokyo compare with other cities, Paris, London, New York, Denver?
ナショナルパブリックラジオのものですけれども、福島原発の周りの放射能レベルに関するデータについてはいろいろとご説明を伺っているんですけれども、東京における放射能レベルの測定に関してはどのようにお考えでしょうか。どのぐらいのレベルの放射能が東京に見られるんでしょうか。それと他の都市、例えばパリ、ロンドン、ニューヨーク、デンバーなどと比べた場合に東京における通常のレベルというのはどのぐらいのレベルなんでしょうか。他の都市と比べた場合に。
文科省の川原田でございます。今お配りしたこの資料の中のですね、34ページに全国のですね、各都道府県の放射線レベルのデータが入っています。で、34ページにはですね、北海道からずっと各都道府県のやつが入ってまして、13番目に東京というのがあります。
I am Kawada from MEXT. If you can look at the documents and the material that MEXT has distributed for this press briefing and refer to page 34, it shows the radiation level data for each of the prefectures. And on page 36, it gives the levels for each prefecture starting from Hokkaido and onwards. And the 13th from the top are the figures for Tokyo.
34ページです。
On page
34。それで東京は新宿で測っております。で、ここの数字を見ていただきますと、東京の何もない時の平均ですね、これが一番右側に載ってまして、だいたい 0.028 から 0.079 マイクロシーベルトパーアワー、そういう値。
And the values for Tokyo is measured in Shinjuku, in a measuring point in Shinjuku ward. And if you can see the numbers on the very right hand, which gives the average levels in normal times, you can see that normally the average radiation level in Tokyo is 0.028 to 0.079 microsieverts per hour.
これが通常のレベルで、その横にずっと数字が並んでおりますけど、4月5日の数字ですが、見ていただきますと、だいたい 0.087 ぐらいから 0.089 ということですから、若干数字よりも若干高いという感じです。
And to the left of that average normal level, you see all of the levels measured on the 5th of April. And as you can see, all the numbers from the left are somewhere in between 0.087 and 0.089. So the levels for April 5th is just slightly above the normal average levels.
それからその他のですね、今空間放射線量率ですが、その他ドリンキングウォーターにおける放射性物質の値とか、それからドリンキングウォーター。
ドリンキングウォーター。はい。はい。
それからフォールアウトにおける放射性物質の値とか、そういうものもそれぞれのページ言いますと、ドリンキングウォーターは37ページ、それからフォールアウトは39ページに載っております。
And in addition to that, we have the numbers, the measurement levels for the spatial radiation dose rate, also the radioactive material levels in drinking water, which is on page 37, and we also have the levels for radioactive material in fallout, which is on page 39.
で両方とも、つまりドリンクウォーターもフォールアウトも通常ノットデテクタブルでありますので、しかしながら東京では数字が出ておりますので、これはやはり福島第一原子力発電所の影響が若干、レベルは低いんですけど、若干出ているということだと思います。
And for both drinking water and fallout, the normal numbers would be non-detectable. Whereas for the measurements that were made in Tokyo, there is a value or number attached to the in the graph, in the table. Although it is very small, the levels are just a little bit higher than normal, and we expect that this is due to the effect of the Fukushima number 1 nuclear power station.
それからすみません、ニューヨークとかパリとかそういうところのデータが今私持ってないので分かりませんが、国によってかなり上下がありますので、どっか資料に出ておりますので、また必要であればお知らせいたします。
And also regarding the cities like New York and Paris that you mentioned in your question, I don't have the data for New York, Paris, and other cities, so I would not be able to tell. But there is quite amount of variation depending on the country. We do have the data. I don't have it with me now. So if it is necessary, we could inform you again at a later date.
今パリとかニューヨークのデータありませんけれども、例えばブラジルのガラパリというところはこれは非常に放射線が高いところですが、東京の約20倍の放射線の強さがあります。これは多分その土ですね、花崗岩とか宇宙線とかそういうものの影響だと思います。非常に地球上でもばらつき、大きいところ小さいところがあるというデータだというふうに理解していただきたいと思います。
宇宙線って宇宙からの放射能ですね。I don't have the numbers numbers for Paris and New York, but for instance, we have in the case of Garapari in Brazil, which this area has a very high level of radioactivity, about 20 times the normal levels that we have in Japan. Probably partly due to the soil, such as the volcanic rocks, and also because of the radioactive rays from space. So there is quite a variation depending on the area and depending on the country.
Okay.
Yes, I'm Andrew Pollack with the New York Times for Mr. Nishiyama. We reported just in the last few hours on a document prepared by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States, which seemed to suggest the problems are perhaps worse than are being portrayed, and that there's various challenges such as the stress on the containment structures from all the water that's being dumped in, and what might happen if there's another quake to those structures, the possibility of hydrogen being created by all that water itself being hit by radiation and breaking off the hydrogen, and the buildup of salt and the slumping fuel inhibiting the cooling water from actually reaching some of the cores in places that have to be cooled down. I was wondering if you would, comment on that assessment by the NRC and what it signifies. And I'd also be interested in whether the decision to inject the nitrogen was the result of this report.
ニューヨーク・タイムズですけれども、西山審議官に伺いたいと思います。私ども、アメリカの NRC が作成した文書にのっとって、数時間前にレポートを、報道をしたところなんですけれども、その元になった NRC の文書では、実際に今語られているよりも状況は悪いのではないかということを示唆しており、いろいろな課題が実際には存在するのではないかということを示唆しております。例えば水をあれだけ注入あるいは放水していることによってその格納容器の構造にストレスがかかっているのではないかと。で、再び揺れがあった場合はどうなるのだろうかと。その格納容器にこれだけストレスがかかっているので、そしてさらに水素が水によって作られていて、水が放射能に当たり、それによって水素が出来上がって発生しているし、さらに塩分、塩もどんどん蓄積していると。そしてこういった結果、実際には冷却せねばならない中核の炉心の部分に水が到達するのを妨げているのではないかというような意見がというようなことを示唆している NRC の報告が出ておりますけれども、こういった NRC の評価に関してコメントをいただきたいと思いますし、これはどういったことを意味するのかということも伺いたいと思います。そして窒素を注入するという決定はこのような NRC の報告の結果行われた決定なのでしょうか。
まず水を、まずその前に、NRC のメンバーは日本に来日されていて、毎日緊密な連携をとっております。
First of all, I wish to mention that the members of the NRC are here in Japan, and we are working closely with them every day.
ですから我々は今私どもの福島のプラントについての情報をほぼシェアしていると考えています。
And we are sharing almost all information regarding the Fukushima plant.
で水による格納容器の劣化というのについては確かに格納容器にとっては非常に珍しい経験をしているわけですからそういうことはある程度考えられるかとは思いますけれども、今現実に多少の余震があったとしてもそれによって緊急の危険があるというふうには我々は考えておりません。
And regarding the degradation of the containment vessel due to the water, it is true, I must say, that for the containment vessel, they are going through a very rare experience. So to a certain extent, that may be possible. But even if we were to have an afterquake right now, I do not believe that would lead to any emergency or urgent dangerous situation.
それから水素についてはほぼ認識を共有していることもあって我々も窒素の封入を考えておりましたけれどもNRC の方々も同じ認識だと思います。
And regarding nitrogen, I believe we share the same understanding. And we were considering injecting nitrogen, and the members from the NRC, I believe, have the same view.
それから塩分については当初やむを得ず緊急の措置として入れましたけれども、これについてはアメリカ の NRC やエネルギー省などからも非常に強い示唆があって、それも我々参考にして、早い段階でなるべく早く真水に切り替えようと思って、今、切り替えを終えたところです。
And regarding the buildup of salt, this was an emergency measure that was taken. The use of seawater was an emergency measure that was taken, and when we had no other choice in the initial stages. We have, however, received a very strong indication from the U.S. NRC as well as the Department of Energy, and using as a reference their views, we also have been working to switch over to fresh water as soon as possible, and right now we have completed switch over to fresh water.
最後に今回まだ窒素を入れるかどうかの決定をしておりませんけれども、今まさにその最終段階にありますが、このレポートによってというよりも我々の判断もそのような窒素を入れるべきということでしたし、NRC との意見交換でもそれが裏付けられたということだと思います。
And lastly, we have not yet made a final decision whether to inject nitrogen or not. And we are precisely in the final stages of making that decision. But rather than this being a result of the NRC report, we of our own judgment also believe that we should be injecting nitrogen. And our position has been substantiated and reinforced through our exchange of views with the NRC.
This is a question for the representative from the Fisheries Agency. I only have one question, so it's a large question.
これは水産庁の方への質問で、質問一つなんですけれども、ちょっと大きな質問です。
You mentioned lance, mackerel, and sardines that are being sampled. I'm curious what other fish are in the area, what direction do the fish swim in, how far and how fast, and what bigger fish eat those small fish, and where do those bigger fish go to? Thank you.
先ほどのお話ではイカナゴとイワシとそれとごめんなさい等を測定しているとおっしゃいましたけれども、他にはどういう魚がこの地域にはこの海域にはいるんでしょうか。そしてこういった魚というのはどちらの方向に泳いでいってどのぐらい遠くまでどのぐらいの速度で泳いでいっているんでしょうか。そしてこういった小さな小型の魚はさらにどのような大きな魚に食べられていて、この測定された小さな魚を食べた大きな魚はその後どこに泳ぎ着いていくんでしょうか。
まず他に測定している魚はあるのかどうかということでございますが、ただいまですね、実施していますのは、今市場に出回っているような魚を主として測定しております。イカナゴイワシの他にですね、マサバ、ヤリイカ、ヒラメ、スズキ、ハマグリ、ブリ、それからキンメダイ、それからですね、淡水魚としましてはコイ、イワナ、などをですね、測定しております。
すいません、この魚の名前英語のリストなんかないですよね。
今日も かなりたくさんの魚はやっておりますので、水産庁のホームページに出てますので、それを見ていただければ、英語も出てると思いますので、はい。
First of all, in response to your question about what kind of other fish are we monitoring we are mainly monitoring fish and other products that come to market or that are placed on the market. And so, in addition to the lance fish and the sardines I talked to you about earlier. The interpreter apologized. He does not know the English names of all these fish. So they include like flounder and skipjack and others. I'm sorry. And the member from the Ministry of Agriculture Fisheries Agency mentions that he does have a whole list, the total list, on the Fisheries Agency's website. And they are also monitoring freshwater fish like carp and iwanago. I'm sorry, I don't know the English term.
2番目ですけれども、その魚はどのくらいの速度でどのくらいの範囲にいるのかということでございますが、まずですね、魚、2種類ございまして、表層回遊する魚ですね。表層から中層回遊する魚、これはイカナゴやですね、イワシ、それからサバでございます。それから低層にいる魚、これは金目鯛のような魚で、低制魚ですね、この2つを測定しております。で、表層低制魚につきましては、その海域に、沿岸域にてそう多くその広い範囲に対して回遊はいたしませんが、表層魚につきましては、現在のところですね、千葉県の沖合だいたい50キロぐらいのところに、イワシ、それからサバの漁場ができております。
And in response to your second question about how far and how fast these fish swim, I think these fish can be divided into two types of fish. The fish that navigate the surface layer of the sea or the medium layer of the sea, which include the lance fish, sardines, and mackerel. Whereas on the other hand, there are fish that would navigate the more deeper layers of the sea, such as the kinmedai. This is the kind of sea bream. And we are... ありがとうございます。And we are measuring both of these. Kinmedai, the English translation seems to be Alfonsino is the actual the English translation. And we are measuring both of these. And for the fish that navigate mainly the deeper layers of the sea, they do not navigate around over a wider area in the coastal area. Whereas for fish, the types of fish that navigate the surface layer, like sardines and mackerel, they seem to have their fishing ground about 50 kilometers offshore of Chiba, offshore the coast of Chiba.
もう一つのですね、どのような魚に食べられるのかということでございますけれども、イワシなどはですね、カツオや、それからマグロに食されます。で、カツオマグロにつきましてもですね、今後その測定していく予定ではございます。
And also in response to your question about what kind of larger fish eat these smaller fish. Fish like sardine are eaten by skipjack and tuna, and we are planning to monitor these skipjack and the tuna as well going forward.
So why hasn't it been monitored yet? And where do you plan on catching the skipjack and the tuna that you're monitoring, considering those fish travel far? they may eat a sardine in front of Fukushima and then be in Chile in a month, perhaps.
なぜそういった魚をまだ測定していないんでしょうか。そういった魚っていうのはおそらくカツオとかマグロだと思いますけれども、でこういったカツオとかマグロなどはその沿岸のどのあたりで取ったものを測定しようと考えていらっしゃるんでしょうか。なぜ伺うかというと、例えば福島の沖合でイワシを食べた魚が1ヶ月後にはもしかしたらチリまで泳いで渡っているかもしれませんので。
まずですね、カツオマグロの今漁をする時期ではないので、その福島沖、それから、日本のですね東北の沖には、まだ漁場ができてないので、取れていないということがあります。
First of all, it is not the season for catching or fishing skipjack and tuna. And so that is perhaps why we have not yet found a fishing ground in offshore the Tohoku area or offshore Fukushima, and that may be why we have not been able to catch them yet.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Germany, Minami-Deutsche新聞. So far, most of the contaminations we had, most of the radiations where we reached or passed the level was iodine 131. Now, this is probably comparably good news because of the short half-life of iodine 131. Now, in Chernobyl, cesium was the biggest problem, especially for the food chain in wide parts of Europe. Can you explain why we have so relatively smaller cesium data? Is that because of measurement, or is that because of the type of the reactor? And now, interestingly, this konago, this fish that has been caught with above the limit levels, this fish is cesium contaminated. So how do you explain that if the other measurements were so relatively low on cesium? Thank you.
南ドイツ新聞ですけれども、今まで、測定、されてきた汚染とか放射能レベルのほとんどは、要素131でして、これは要素131というのは半減期が短いので、これは汚染、放射能検出されている放射能のほとんどだということは、朗報、相対的に考えれば朗報と言えると思うんですが、チェルノブイリの場合はセシウムが最大の問題で、特にヨーロッパの広範囲にわたる食物連鎖の中で大きな問題となりました。なので、なぜ日本から出ている今回のデータではセシウムに関するデータおよび測定レベルが少ないんでしょうか。これは測定の仕方なんでしょうか。それとも炉の種類で炉の種類が原因なんでしょうか。例えばコーナゴは基準値を超えていたという結果が出ており、コーナゴの場合はほとんどの汚染源が検出された放射物質がセシウムなんですけれども、他の測定ではセシウムの値がこんなに低いのに、なぜコーナゴでこんなにセシウムが検出されたのか、これはどう説明されるんでしょうか。
まずチェルノブイリとの違いはこの放射性物質が空中に出た時の出方の違いが一番大きいのではないかと思います。チェルノブイリの時は爆発的に、格納容器もない状態の中で爆発的に出たということがあって、日本の場合は必ずしもそうではないということですので、その違いが一番大きく効いているのではないかと思います。
The greatest difference between the incident we have now and Chernobyl is that the way in which the radioactive material was released into the atmosphere, I believe, is very different. In the case of the Chernobyl accident, they did not have a containment vessel in the first place, and the radioactive material was released explosively into the atmosphere, whereas in the case that we are having now in Japan, that is not necessarily the case. And I believe this is what is appearing as a major difference.
高ナゴとセシウムの関係はよくわかりません。
And I'm not sure. I don't know the reason for the reason for. I mean, I don't know how we can explain the detected cesium in the Konago and the other readings.
非常に単純なことでございまして、暫定基準値にセシウムということが暫定基準として決まっておりまして、要素につきましては魚の場合暫定基準値の決定がなされてませんでしたので、セシウムだけを載せてたということでございます。現在は水産庁のホームページには要素も含まれた形でアップされております。
Let me explain about the cesium. This is a very simple matter. This is because the provisional regulation standards have been determined for cesium, whereas we did not have the provisional regulation standards for iodine for fish. Until recently. And that is why we were only providing the data for the cesium. But now, if you can look at the Fisheries Agency website, we also have data for the iodine as well.
それとなぜ要素がその暫定基準値に入っていなかったかということでございますけれども、これにつきましてはですね、要素の半減期が非常に短いということが一つございます。それから海水中で拡散してしまうので非常に濃度が低くなるということでございます。それとそういった理由で魚それから肉類については暫定基準値が当初設定されていなかったというふうに聞いております。
And if I may explain the reason why we did not have a provisional regulation standard for iodine in the beginning, what I have been told was that there was no provisional regulation standard for iodine at the outset for fish and meat. For one, because the half-life of iodine is very short, and two, because it dissipates and becomes very diluted in the seawater.
Thank you, Azhari. Pan Orient News. This question is for Mr. Nishiyama. You mentioned that highly irradiated water might appear elsewhere in the reactor again. So could you elaborate on this issue? And does that mean you are not in full control of containing any bigger crisis in the units? Thank you.
パンオリエントニュースですけれども、西山審議官にお尋ねいたします。先ほど炉の他のところ、他の場所で放射能レベルの高い水がまた出てくるかもしれないというようなことをおっしゃいましたけれども、これをもう少し詳しくご説明いただけますでしょうか。ということは現在の危機的な状況において全体に関して完全にコントロールのもとに置いているわけではないということなんでしょうか。
私が申し上げたのは、2号機の原子炉に由来すると思われる高い放射能濃度の水が海の近くのピットというところの横の壁の亀裂から海に注いでいたことについて、その水を止めることには成功したんですけれども、止めたということはその流れる力があれば、それが別途どこかに出てきてしまう可能性があるということを認識しているということです。
What I said was that the highly irradiated water from the reactor of unit number 2 has been flowing into the sea through the crack that was found on the side wall of the pit. That is a pit close by. And while we have been able to stop the water from flowing out from the crack in the sidewall of the pit, as long as the water is flowing, what I meant to say was that we understand that there is a possibility of that water coming out somewhere else.
Any other questions?
Yes, Andrew Pollack from the New York Times. For the gentleman from the Fisheries Agency, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. You mentioned the monitoring, and it sounds like you're going to be maybe catching some fish. But if there's a new standard, like a new rule on the levels of radiation in the fish, are you going to be enforcing that regulation? Are you going to be going to Tsukiji and saying, you know, you can't sell this fish because its radiation level is too high? Or are you just monitoring it for the environmental information? And I also just wanted to clarify, is there a no fishing zone around the plant, and how big is that?
ニューヨーク・タイムズもですけれども、水産庁の方にご質問をしたいと思います。2点ほど確認したい点があるんですけれども、先ほどのモニタリングのところのご説明ですと、何か魚を捕まえてきて、測定するのかのように聞こえたんですけれども、その新しい暫定規制値ができたのであれば、それを実際に執行をするのでしょうか。すなわち築地市場に行って、この魚は放射能レベルが高いので販売はしてはならないというようなことに、この新しく定められた暫定規制値を運用するんでしょうか。それとも暫定規制値というのは単にモニタリングをするためだけのものなんでしょうか。それと現在福島原発の周りに関して漁業禁止区域は設けられているんでしょうか。もし設けられているとすれば、どのぐらいの大きさなんでしょうか。
まず最初の質問でございますけれども、これにつきましてはですね、水産庁にちょっと答える立場ではないので、これにつきましては厚生労働省の方のお答えをいただくことになると思います。
First of all, with regard to your first question, the Fisheries Agency is not in a position to respond to your first question. It would be up to the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, I believe, who is the one to be responding to that question.
2番目の質問でございますけれども、実際にはですね、立ち入り禁止海域はその原子炉のですね、周りの30キロ圏内というのはこれはあるんですけれども、漁業権上の禁止という措置にはなっております。立ち入りはできませんが、漁業権上の禁止という形にはなってはおりません。ただし福島県につきましては、皆様もご承知のように津波で大きな被害を受けております。漁港、それから漁船、壊滅的な打撃を受けておりまして、今福島県海域で 漁業を行っているということは事実上ございません。
In response to your second question, the area up to 30 kilometers offshore the Fukushima nuclear power station is effectively a no-entry zone. So it is designated as a no-entry zone, but it does not specifically take the form of a no-fishing zone. But the area within 30 kilometers is designated as a no-entry zone. Having said so, however, as you may all know, Fukushima Prefecture has suffered a major damage, heavy damages from the tsunami, and all the fishing ports and fishing vessels have suffered a devastating blow, devastating damage. And so effectively, there are no vessels that are now fishing offshore, that are fishing in Fukushima Prefecture at the moment.
And let me just supplement that yesterday there was instruction coming from the special headquarters. This is Nuclear Disaster Response Headquarters, giving instruction to Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, and there are, as has been discussed, setting the new provisional standard values for the marine products regarding radioactive iodines. MHLW is in a position to take measures, and they will also consult with the Food Safety Commission on what is appropriate measures to take. Regarding the detailed response of MHLW, I'd like to have official from MHLW to be represented for tomorrow's briefing, just as a homework. Thank you very much. And given the time, if you have a very last question, I will take them. Dennis.
Dennis Normile of Science Magazine. A question about the soil monitoring and the effects. If I understand it correctly, a group at Kyoto University is saying that even if you have relatively low levels of radioactivity in the soil, the dose that could be accumulated by someone, say, standing above the soil or sitting on the ground or something, could accumulate rather, to significant levels over a period of time. Up to, if you start out with a reading of 10 microsieverts per hour, well, over 24 hours, that would be a dose of 240 microsieverts. And if you do that if you get that for 10 days, you're up to 2 millisieverts. And does that pose a health risk? And are there any areas where the concentration of radioactivity in the soil will interfere with spring planting, that is, for agricultural use?
サイエンスマガジンのものですけれども、土壌のモニタリング並びにその影響に関して伺いたいんですけれども、私の理解が正しければ京都大学のグループが言うには、土壌の放射能レベルが比較的低いレベルであっても、その線量がどんどん蓄積して、例えばその土の上に立っていたり、あるいは地面に座ったりしているうちに、どんどん累積して、相当高いレベルに時間の経過とともに達するということを言っております。例えば1時間あたり10マイクロシーベルトだといっても、24時間で240マイクロシーベルトですし、それを10日間 に換算すると2ミリシーベルトになります。ですので、そうなるとこの線量は健康リスクになるのではないでしょうか。それと土壌の放射能濃度のために農業で春の作付けに支障が出る地域というのはあるのでしょうか。
ソイルのですね、値っていうのは一応私配りましたペーパーの中に載っております。ソイル失礼どこだっけな。どうだっけな。ソイル最初のところのペー目次のところに、そうですね、17ページというのがあって、
The value in soil is included in the document, the material that we have distributed to you. And if you can look at the table of contents, I believe soil levels would be on page 17.
そこにはダストでありますとか、の含まれるもののそれぞれの福島の地点における線量率、それから放射能レベルというのがどうかというデータは一応あります。
And on page 17, you can see the dose rate as well as the radiation level in the dust for various monitoring points within Fukushima.
今おっしゃったような大きな値の線量になっているところは私の担当のその20キロ以上のところにはそれほど大きな値が出ていないというふうに思います。ただその後の質問はちょっと私の担当じゃないのでよくわかりません。
As far as the area that I am responsible for monitoring, which is an area beyond 20 kilometers and beyond, we do not see any large dose rates. And the very last part of your question would not fall under my responsibility.
放射線の累積については当然これは過去の累積の部分もそれから将来にわたって積み上がっていく部分も考慮した上でその避難の地域を決めるなど判断をすることになります。
Regarding the accumulation of radioactivity, obviously we are taking into consideration accumulation from the past and accumulation expected in the future in determining the evacuation area.
それはモニタリングに基づいて予測を立てるのではなくてモニタリングに基づいて判断するということです。
And this is determined not based on any prediction, but it is decided based on the monitoring values.
Okay, we'd like to conclude today's briefing, and we'll have another round of briefing tomorrow evening as well. Thank you very much for coming.